Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Tea Time. I am home on San Juan Island for the last day of my fall session home before I head off to Georgia in the US and then 6 different places in Australia. I am feeling eternally grateful to all of you and all of my horses and all of the places I get to be. Life just feels really beautiful right now. So, what a good time to tackle a very complicated subject. I have been asked to do this by a friend of mine, and I had to think about it for a while because it felt like a big one to me. And this is the discussion about sensitization, desensitization, flooding, and learned helplessness. And oof, that feels heavy. Just listing off that list feels like such a big topic to talk about, but let's go ahead and give it a go. So I really believe that everything can be seen on a spectrum. Nothing is entirely good or entirely bad. Everything has a place on the spectrum. And then hopefully, as beautiful, interactive beings, we choose the best place on the spectrum for the time and place that we're in. Now, do I hope that we don't choose learned helplessness in our training? Absolutely. But acknowledging it as part of the spectrum, I think can be really, really useful. So how do we go about defining these things? Again, that's going to be an individual endeavor. You get to define them however you choose to define them, but I'll sort of share with you how I define them, and maybe that'll help you clarify your thoughts on them as well. So sensitization is where you really want a horse to feel more of something. You want them to use their senses. Sensitization. Now, a lot of people have taken this to mean sensitization means you want them to move their body. Like when we put pressure on them, they should respond and move their body. And that's absolutely fine. That's another version of sensitization. Sensitizing the body or sensitizing the sensory system could be 2 different places on the spectrum. I don't think one is good or bad. You guys all know from listening to me, I'm much more about sensitizing the sensory system and then adding the physical system to it so the horse feels more, sees more, is more interested in their life. And that's the way I like to work. Now, desensitization has a really important part in there. When we desensitize, we teach the horse what not to be worried about, what not to respond to, what to ignore. And that has a time and a place. I don't like going as far into desensitization as some trainers do, but I can see there's a time and a place for it. So desensitization, people usually think of that old Western horse sacking a horse out. You get an old burlap bag and you flap it all over their body and they become desensitized to fast movements and feelings and sensations and things like that. And that's a physical desensitization. You are doing something until they feel like they can ignore it. And then when they ignore it, you stop doing it. So they realize that is the correct response. The sooner you ignore it, the sooner it stops. And that's a physical desensitization. Now, a lot of times you can't do that physical desensitization unless you also use an entrapment of the horse, where the horse can't get away from you until they find the right answer. And that has a time and a place, of course. And I find that interesting, but not my preference. So I prefer to use desensitization of the physical system in partnership with sensitization of the sensory system. So let's say I am rubbing that burlap bag all over my horse. I actually want them to know they can ignore the burlap bag. If they're not enjoying it or they're not finding any use in that tickling of their senses, they could look at the sunset, or they could smell the wind, or they could take a deep breath and feel their lungs internally. They can do so much with their senses from the stimulation of that burlap bag on their body. And so that would be sensitizing the sensory system while desensitizing the body. And you can do those things together. So that would be my favorite way to do that. Jennifer, I'm so glad you're here. Jennifer says, good morning, timely topic. My mare goes inward and tunes out all senses. Yeah. So my guess, Jennifer, is that she's had events in her life where that was taught to her as the best way to respond. The sooner you turn off all the senses, the sooner the thing that's happening stops. And so this is sort of a normal type of desensitization that happens a lot, particularly with foals. People do it a lot with baby horses and teach it very, very early on. And so what they do is they add a lot of sensation to the horse's body, and they keep adding it until the horse ignores everything. And when the horse ignores everything, they stop adding, and they let the horse have some peace and harmony to remember that was the right response. And so this is a really interesting thing, because then the question comes up is this flooding or is this learned helplessness? What does that mean? And so again, you get to decide what your definition of those are, but I'll give you mine. And so my definition of flooding is where a horse would really like to get away, but they can't, okay? They would like to leave the situation, but they're not allowed to. And that's where it starts to become flooding. We flood their senses until they come up with the correct response or lack of response, and then we cease the flooding so they know that's the appropriate response. When you do that enough times, you build a habit out of it. And so it sounds like Jennifer's horse here has a habit that was created at some point. I don't know who it was created by. It may have been a person, may have been environment, may have been other horses. It doesn't really matter. But there was a pattern and a habit created that's the best response. So when the sensory system is overly stimulated, what do you do? And this is a lot of training. So what I would like to teach horses to do when I overstimulate their sensory system is have them use a different part of the sensory system. So if the sense of feeling is overwhelmed, I'd like them to switch to the sense of sight, or the sense of hearing, or the sense of smell. If the sense of taste is overwhelmed, I want them to just switch to something that's more comfortable for them. And so the ability to switch senses is their ability to regulate their sense of overwhelm without turning their senses off. Now, will they ever turn their senses off? Of course. They're going to turn their senses off when their sensory system is tired. When their sensory system is tired, they turn their sensory system off and they go inward. And at that point, if we rest at that point, right at that moment where they turn all of their senses off and they go inward, what we are teaching them is that your best response to sensory input is to ignore it. And a lot of people do desensitization that way. I don't think it's our best call, but if I was training police horses that had to walk into chaotic situations, maybe it would be. Maybe that would be my best call. And so you have to think a little bit about what this horse's life is going to be, what they're going to be expected to do, and how we can contribute to that with our training and our development of habits. So flooding is any time you start adding sensory input that the horse would really like to get away from, but they're not allowed to. And so they're being physically restrained from leaving. Now, unfortunately, this does get included when you have control of all the food resources. So we all know from that classic drug addict perspective, a drug addict will do absolutely anything to get their fix. And so a lot of horses who have their access to sugary tastes limited will start acting like a drug addict, in which case they will do anything to get that taste, which includes submitting to flooding. They will allow their senses to be flooded just because they know the ability to get that sensory input of the taste afterwards is worth it. So this is one of the reasons I don't use a lot of taste in my training. I do believe that taste is an integral part of the horse's life. I do acknowledge it. It does happen. There is food around. They're eating as part of training. But I try not to be the one in control of it, because sometimes that can have some downstream effect if you're not doing it very wisely. And so huge respect out there to the positive reinforcement trainers that are doing a good job of managing this, but it's something that needs some awareness. So where does learned helplessness come into this? This is a really tricky topic, because I think it can be overused. And I actually think even I have overused it in the past. So I've put a lot of thought into this. And learned helplessness comes from that original study with electric shocks and dogs, and their inability to find a solution when they were shocked. And they learned helplessness. If they just cower and wait, eventually the electric shock goes away. And even when they had the freedom to leave, they had lost the ability to walk away from that. Now, that is essentially what I think learned helplessness is where they lose the ability to find better solutions. They have one solution only, and all they can do is that one solution. So in previous conversations, I have perhaps said something along the lines that halter training is some degree of learned helplessness. And I think that can be true, but that is not always true. Horses are incredibly big, strong, powerful animals. Why do they let us lead them around with a string on their face when they really don't have to? Particularly into terrible situations where sometimes they get hurt, where sometimes they're very unsafe, and they let us walk them into these spaces with a string on their face. That can be learned helplessness, where they don't think they have any other option. And I'm not a fan of learned helplessness, but I am equally not a fan of teaching horses how to pull on halters. I don't think that's any better. So when I talk about halter training, what I want to do is make sure that the horse has many, many different good ways to have a voice. Can they show me what they're interested in with their eyes, with their ears, with their nose, with their sensory system, not the physical mass of their body, but their sensory system? And am I a good enough partner that I respond? That is what gets us delicately around this idea of learned helplessness. Can I still lead my horses into situations with a string on their face? Yes, I can, because I have built a habit that when I put pressure on the halter, we are going to go through a situation that ends up feeling better afterwards, even if it's a little uncomfortable in the middle. And my horses trust that that's the case. We're going to get through this situation, out the other side, and it's going to feel good. They trust that something's going to be good on the other side. This means they're willing to put up some discomfort in the middle because they trust that it's going to get better. Now, is that learned helplessness? It's getting close on the spectrum. You know, there's definitely that aspect to it, but I don't think that it has the full force of all the terror that people hold about this idea of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is really the inability to think of any other option when something bad happens. There's one response and one response only. I obviously don't want that for any horses out there, but there's always a but, okay? If it comes to my horse running in front of a huge truck and dying, maybe a little learned helplessness off the halter lead rope would be a good thing. Because, you know, one response and one response only, which is don't run in front of the truck, probably worth saving their life. You know, sometimes horses make terrible decisions. And if they're going to make a terrible decision, it's really good that we have ability to redirect that decision. Now, I would rather not be able to redirect it through learned helplessness. I would rather be able to redirect it through the fact that we've built a huge amount of good associations with the sensory pressure of the halter. So when I ask them to turn, they go, Elsa generally has a good idea when she asks me to turn. Let's do that. Okay? When things get worse, they've had enough experiences with me where they go, this is temporary. I know things are going to get better if I just hang in there with Elsa. And so we want to build a pattern where they believe life is going to get better with me. And I believe the way we do that is we stimulate the senses in good ways. I don't use a lot of food rewards. Actually, I don't use any food rewards. There's food in the environment in the ways that I train. But the idea is that the sensory system, taste, hearing, smell, feeling, I'm going to get this sequence wrong, but anyway, the 5 senses, they are the way the horse experiences the world. And if one sense is overwhelmed, they should switch to another sense. And that's the way they should regulate their feelings. Now, when people get afraid that their sensory system isn't strong enough, that their senses are going to get overwhelmed, and then they're going to overreact in their body. And when they overreact in their body, they're going to make life worse for themselves and for everyone around them. This is where people will tend to go to really heavy-handed desensitization or flooding, where they say, I just need you to ignore things that are overwhelming to you. And it's really important that you ignore things that are overwhelming to you, because if you don't ignore them, you're gonna overreact. And if you overreact, you become dangerous for yourself and everybody around you. And that's valid. That's absolutely valid. But sometimes people take things a little bit too far when they don't really need to be taken that far. So if you don't have time to teach a horse to use its sensory system well and help it strengthen its sensory system, then perhaps an alternative is to teach them to just relax and ignore everything that's overwhelming. And that can be useful. It's not my preference, but it can be useful. The downside of that, if you teach them to just relax and ignore everything that might be overwhelming to them, the downside of that is you may end up with a horse that becomes habituated to just shutting down and going internal frequently, anytime anything tickles their senses. And that's not a very alive way to live. The social structure for that horse is going to be a little bit more complicated. The ability to listen to directions, conversations, instructions is going to become dulled if that's their response to life. So what a lot of people do is they start out with a ton of desensitization, make sure the horse doesn't overreact to anything. Whether they do it through some really, kind desensitization, or they get a little heavy-handed and they get into flooding, what they do is they want to make sure the horse is not going to overreact and threaten themselves or threaten others. And that's understandable. Then from there, we end up having to get a bigger lunge whip, a bigger flag, a bigger lead chain over the nose to go with the lead rope, a bigger bit, a bigger set of spurs. So to the degree we have over desensitized them, we will then need to resensitize them when we want them to be more socially involved. And that's pretty normal in the horse world. That's how most training goes. This is where I come in with a little bit of an alternative, and that is that you can re-educate the sensory system. You can teach the horse that when their senses get stimulated, the best thing to do is use your senses. And if the senses get tired, the best thing to do is switch to a different sense. Now, inevitably, at some point, the whole sensory system gets tired. They will need to shut down and rest and relax. But hopefully that happens as a default when nothing is calling their attention. It's a default when they don't need to respond to anything anymore. And so I personally don't believe we should be desensitizing to relaxation, because I think you're just going to have to work 10 times harder later if that's the way you do your desensitization. I think we should be doing our desensitization of the body in combination with sensitization of the sensory system. And that is the part of the spectrum that I think is the sweet spot. It takes a little longer. It takes a little bit more work. We have to strengthen a million little teeny tiny muscles between the brain and the body to get that to work well. It's not as instantaneous a result as your flooding or your more heavy-handed desensitization, where you just shut the horse down to everything and just get them to relax in response to any stimuli. Those are going to work faster. And so if you need a really fast result, that might be your best option. Okay, I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for them. I'm saying we should see it on a spectrum, and you get to choose what you think is the best option for your horse in your situation. Learned helplessness, I do think there's a time and a place for a little bit of learned helplessness. It's usually when you don't have time to develop the whole system to make sure the horse can stay safe. So we're going to use a little bit of learned helplessness in our training, where the horse has one response and one response only if we think there is a safety issue and we think the horse needs to just stay alive long enough to learn more. And in that case, yeah, a little bit of learned helplessness is going to be good. Now, do we want to grow out of that? Yes, absolutely. And I fully believe that we can. So in those situations where they said learned helplessness was kind of sticky and dogs in the experiments couldn't seem to learn new things after they had learned helplessness, I believe that that's not really true. That's sort of a clinical setting issue. When you have the social structure of lots of friends around you, lots of new environments, lots of things happening, lots of variations in your day, I do think humans and horses and dogs are designed to be learners. And we are designed to learn new options. But we need a healthy input and a healthy resting system and a healthy body to be able to gather those new inputs. So I don't think learned helplessness is forever. I also really don't think that we should counter learned helplessness with teaching the horse to tow us around on the end of a lead rope and pull against halters. I think that's a terrible alternative. So halter training is an interesting subject with horses. And if you want to do it really, really well, I think you want to link using your halter with activating their sensory system first. So when they feel the pressure of the halter, you see those ears mobilize. You see those eyes mobilize. You see them become more interested in the world. Then from there, we take that more interested in the world into physical movements, where we can use pressure to get physical movements, but it's including the sensory system. This is how we avoid having this learned helplessness aspect of halter training, or whatever it is that you're doing. You want them to feel like they can gather information through their senses, and if it's overwhelming, they can change the senses they're using, or they can change the thing they're focused on. And in the best possible world, they can get your attention doing so. So the horse can change the subject. When they're uncomfortable, they can say, "Hey, look at that over there. Isn't that interesting?" And you listen. That is their best skill to redirect when they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And that's really the tool that I want to give my horses that keeps them out of that realm of learned helplessness. They know how to get what they need, but they know how to get it with good conversational skills using their sensory system more than their motor system, their physical system. So I hope that gives you a little food for thought when it comes to that sensitization, desensitization, flooding, and learned helplessness. Seeing it on the spectrum has been really helpful for me. I encourage you guys to come up with your own descriptions of this and your own understanding of it. But if we share with each other, hopefully we help each other have good points of view that are useful and that actually yield really good results with the horses. So I want to thank Thank you, Tamara, for suggesting that I take up this topic. It took me a couple of months to think about it, and it's good. So please, all of you guys, if you have a topic you'd like me to talk about, I'm not sure I can do it tomorrow. Sometimes I want to let it sit in my brain for a little while, be practiced and thought about, and even, part of conversations as I'm traveling. But I will get back to it. So please make your suggestions. I would love to tackle any conversation you guys are interested in having. I am headed on the ferry today at 3:30 this afternoon, headed to Georgia for a clinic in the US, and then off to Australia for 6 weeks. And I am looking forward to seeing all of you guys that I get to see on this journey. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Leave them in the comments. Thank you, guys.